Now, if the Genesis account in the Bible is true, shouldn't there be evidence to support it?
Why does the evidence always seem to support evolution? Today on Creation Magazine Live. Welcome to Creation Magazine Live. I'm Calvin Smith.
And I'm Richard Fangrad.
You know, evolutionists, they often define science in a way that actually omits the possibility of creation being true. Because the question we're here to talk about today is, why does the evidence always seem to support evolution?
Funny how that is, yes.
Yeah, I mean, everywhere you go, school system, everything. I've had people say that, but if evolution isn't true, how come there's so much overwhelming evidence for it? Well, here's the first thing. If you define science in a way that omits creation, guess what? It's always going to point to evolution.
Yes. Here's Roger Lewontin from Harvard.
Richard
Richard Lewontin. That's my name. I should have got that. Our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of many of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have an a priori commitment, a commitment to materialism. It is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation for the phenomenal world, but, on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door.
Right.
That's a mouthful.
There's a mouthful, but you basically break it down this way. I don't care what the evidence is. It's going to point to methodological naturalism. This is all it is. It's just
naturalism
is because we're not going to allow God, and that's it. You know, and this idea has a real long history. You know, James Hutton, he's the guy who kind of re-kicked and restarted the idea of millions of years. Look at what he said. Now this was actually before he'd examined the evidence from geology to a great degree, but he said this: the past history of our globe must be explained by what we can be seen to be happening now. No powers are to be employed that are not natural to the globe, no action to be admitted except of those which we know the principle. So he wrote that before he'd actually looked at the evidence. Well, yeah. You're already excluding many, many things there.
And scientists often believe something before they find evidence for it. For example, in this quote here by Boyce Renzenberger, he says, "At this point, it is necessary to reveal a little inside information about how scientists work, something the textbooks don't usually tell you. The fact is that scientists are not really as objective and dispassionate in their work as they would like you to think. Most scientists first get their ideas about how the world works not through rigorously logical processes, but through hunches and wild guesses. As individuals, they often come to believe something to be true long before they assemble the hard evidence that will convince somebody else that it is. Motivated by faith in his own ideas and a desire for acceptance by his peers, a scientist will labor for years, knowing in his heart that his theory is correct, but devising experiment after experiment whose results he hopes will support his position."
Look what he says. They start with faith, motivated by their own faith.
Exactly.
They've got their own faith. It's not science versus faith. They've got their own faith. Even atheistic evolutionist Isaac Asimov, a very brilliant man, but look what he said. He said, "I have faith and belief myself. I believe that the universe is comprehensible within the bounds of natural law and that the human brain can discover those natural laws and comprehend the universe. I believe that nothing beyond those natural laws is needed. I have no evidence for this. It's simply what I have faith in and what I believe." Interesting, isn't it?
So quote after quote of faith, belief comes first, then comes the science behind it. Interesting.
Exactly.
S.C. Todd, an immunologist at Kansas State University, summed it up perfectly when he said, even if all the data point to an intelligent designer, such an hypothesis is excluded from science because it's not naturalistic. I guess we can say, yes, it would be excluded from science because science involves observation and natural laws and so on.
Right.
But they're talking about evolution.
Right.
They're equating science and evolution and saying, well, it's excluded from science. What they mean is evolution.
So point number one, why does it always point to evolution? Because there's a massive bias against it, against creation.
Imagine hearing that someone has just won the lottery 3 times in the same year, or a golfer has hit 5 consecutive holes in one. We approach such improbable stories with healthy skepticism. Considering the formation of the first living cell by a perfect arrangement of carbohydrates, fats, proteins and genetic material in a warm pond, Nobel Prize winner Francis Crick said, "It seems almost impossible to give any numerical value to the probability of what seems a rather unlikely sequence of events. An honest man could only state that in some sense the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle." The evolutionist Robert Shapiro at this point would prefer to abandon all skepticism. Why need the event have been probable? We can just stare at the odds, shrug and note with thanks how lucky we were. When we abandon healthy skepticism, only gullibility remains, to invoke miracles without God.
To find out more from Creation Ministries International, visit our website, creation.com.
Well, welcome back. We're talking about why does the evidence always seem to point towards evolution when people talk about science, etc., on TV? Well, in this segment, what I'd like to do is dispel the myth that evolution is a fact and it's just, too strong to argue against.
Yes, we've got Richard Dawkins is a great writer, but sometimes when he's speaking, he says some very interesting things. Here's one of our favorite Dawkins quotes here. Bill Moyers, he was interviewed on the show. The interviewer asked him, is evolution a theory, not a fact? Dawkins' response is, evolution has been observed, it's just that it hasn't been observed while it's happening.
Right. Now, I use this quote a lot, and you can see people's jaws drop, especially skeptics, and they look at you, and sometimes people have wanted to challenge me, well, that's not what he really meant, or whatever. But you can go and look up the transcript. This is fully in context, what Dawkins said here. I mean, he didn't just oopsie or something like that. His belief in evolution is so strong that he sees evolution everywhere, right? But he admits it hasn't been observed while it's happening, which means it's not observable science, it's not empirical science. So, I mean, this quote has caused Dawkins great pain, right? As people like us repeat it. So he was actually on a show called The Genius of Charles Darwin a couple years later. In my opinion, he was probably trying to do some damage control on this one because even a lot of skeptics have been upset by this one. But this is what he had, and this time he scripted it out. He had a chance to think about this. It wasn't just off the cuff. He said, nobody has actually seen evolution take place over a long period, which means he's just reiterated what he said the first time. Nobody's seen it. But they have seen the after effects, and the after effects are massively supported. Then he said it's like a case in a court of law where nobody can actually stand up and say, I saw the murder happen. Which is now for the third time he's admitted he can't see it. He just keeps saying it. But see what he says? But millions and millions of pieces of evidence, they all point to evolution. No reasonable person can dispute that. But see, he used a courtroom analogy. And I like to point this out to people. If we went to see the local court proceedings and there was the facts and you got this adversarial system. So you got the prosecutor and you got the defense, let's say. Every time the prosecution went to talk about the facts, everybody just sat there and listened to them. Every time the defense tried to mount a defense, no, you can't say anything.
Yeah.
And they got muzzled. Well, what kind of court system would that be? It'd be a joke.
Yeah, kangaroo court.
And in Canada, we can only speak for our own country, although we get data from other countries. The official curriculum in Canada, the only way they explain origins to kids is one way, evolution.
Yes.
So you can't even mention creation. You can't even, they don't even bring that up. The defense never gets a chance to talk about the facts, so no wonder people just believe in evolution.
Right, and far from the facts screaming evolution, the most natural way of often interpreting the data would seem to run counter to this notion of millions of years of slow and gradual accumulation and so on. For example, Stephen Jay Gould, a famous scientist from Harvard years ago, said
an evolutionist.
An evolutionist, yes, of course. The absence of fossil evidence for intermediate stages between major transitions in organic design, indeed our inability, even in our imagination, to construct functional intermediates, in many cases, has been a persistent and nagging problem for gradualistic accounts of evolution.
Yeah, so here he admits that when you look at the fossil record, we don't see those gradual changes and stuff like that in things. And so what's interesting about Gould is he was an atheist, an evolutionist.
Sure.
He admitted,
Yep.
no, the fossils don't point to evolution. And he continued, said the extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record persists as the trade secret of paleontology, as in, hey, there's a bunch of people out there saying that, oh, the fossils prove evolution, but they don't. So he admits
Right.
this. But what did he do? Did he abandon his faith in evolution? No, he came up with a concept called punctuated equilibrium, which was a new
Yes.
way to evolve things, which said, you know, creatures stay the same for millions of years, and then they evolve so quickly, there's no fossil evidence
There's no
for it.
preservation in the, yeah.
But even
yeah.
he was probably the most honest atheist and skeptic I've ever seen in terms of his, you know, talking about science, right?
Yeah, but he admitted his faith in gradual evolution. He said this: the idea of punctuated equilibria is just as much a preconceived picture as that of phyletic gradualism.
Mm-hmm.
We readily admit our bias toward it and urge readers in the ensuing discussion to remember that our interpretations are as colored by our preconceptions as are the claims of the champions of phyletic gradualism by theirs.
Right. So here we see these admissions when you really dig deep into the philosophy of these men. And he was very honest. And a lot of times people won't be that honest with the evidence. But he's saying, listen, I've got a faith, I've got a belief.
Yes.
Even if the evidence
Yep.
doesn't back it up, I'm going to come up with a new way of explaining it. And we're going to talk about more of that when we come back.
With all the responsibilities that most pastors have, it is often too much to ask them to keep up with all the latest science that supports the Bible and creation. The Information Department at CMI reviews the leading evolutionary science publications so that our scientists and speakers are both constantly updated with the latest evolutionist information and able to refute it. Give your pastor a break. Book a CMI speaker into your church for a faith-strengthening Sunday morning message. Visit creation.com to contact your nearest CMI office.
Welcome back to Creation Magazine Live, and we're talking about why does the evidence always seem to point towards evolution? Well, we've given you a couple of clues so far if you've been following along.
Yes.
But you know, evolutionists often claim that creationists, you know, we just ignore scientific evidence, you know, in favor of evolution because we just believe the Bible. So we're willing to just ignore, you know, stuff and turn a blind eye, and it's just a blind faith, you know. But the fact that is, if you watch the last segment, we've shown, for an example, in the case of Gould,
Right.
You know, evolutionists, you know, often say, well, you know, we're open to reinterpreting evidence. If we get new facts, we'll change our mind. But you creationists, you just stick to your Bible story.
Yeah.
But wait, we're open to changing our ideas about things too. See, everybody sticks to the basic premise. An evolutionist isn't willing to give up the concept of evolution happening somehow.
Over millions of years.
They
Yeah.
might be, well, maybe there's different ways that it could have happened. But they're not going to give up on evolution in millions of years as an atheist. There's no way they can do that. So
Right.
we
Yeah.
need to be honest about that.
In the 90s, there was a book on geology that came out by an anti-creationist, Derek Ager, and he postulated neocatastrophism against gradualism. Neocatastrophism is that the layers of rock weren't laid down gradually over millions of years. There was a catastrophe that laid down layers, and then there was millions of years of nothing that happened, and then a catastrophe that happened. And so the
And
evidence
this countermanded what had commonly been taught, that it's slow sedimentation over millions of years building up gradually.
Right. And so, and he said this in his book. He said, if one estimates the total thickness of the British coal measures as about 1,000 meters laid down in about 10 million years, then assuming a constant rate of sedimentation, it would have taken 100,000 years to bury a tree 10 meters high, which is ridiculous.
And that's what creationists had been saying for years. That's ridiculous.
Yes. Yeah, he goes on, he says, we cannot escape the conclusion that sedimentation was at times very rapid. Indeed, and at other times, there were long breaks in sedimentation, though it looks both uniform and continuous.
Now, look at what he just said. It looks uniform and continuous,
Right.
but we know that
That there's millions of years somewhere, even though we can't see it.
but it's not based on evidence, right? You know, evolutionists often know things despite the evidence. Dr. Ralph Molnar, he's on Discovery Channel, and he's talking about this extinct lizard called Megalania, right?
Okay.
And he's got his bone in his hand, and he's talking about it. And this is what he said. I want you to notice the difference between what he says, he believes, but what he's observing, all right? He says, this specimen actually looks like it had come from an animal that looks like it died 200 or 300 years ago. All dry, chalky, this sort of thing. Doesn't actually mean it died 200 or 300 years ago. In Montana, I've seen dinosaur bones that look like they've come from animals that died 200 or 300 years ago. I know very well that they died much longer than that. It gives a suggestion that Megalania may have been alive fairly recently. Here's this scientist. Science is based on observation for the most part. He's observing, it looks really young, but I know. How does he know that? He knows it in his
Not
mind.
from the observations, because it doesn't look millions of years old.
Exactly. So just like Dawkins, he sees evolution, but not when it's happening, right?
Yeah. Often the obvious conclusion is never mentioned.
Right. Watch.
Paul Davies makes a quote here. It's just amazing. How did stupid atoms spontaneously write their own software? Nobody knows. Really? There is no known law of physics able to create information from nothing. Well, great. There's no known law of physics, so physics didn't do it.
Exactly.
Like, is that not? He's almost there.
He's
but
almost
not quite.
there, but he won't reach the natural conclusion. And there is no natural way that we can account for information.
No natural way. Yeah.
But what way do we know that information can be accounted for?
Well, humans can generate it from their brains.
So an intelligent designer can create information. I mean, this quote, these pixels that you're looking at, this quote on our screen, or you're hearing us, all that information, all information, coded information, we know comes from an intelligent mind. But he just walks right over it. Why? Because he's got an a priori commitment to materialism, because he won't allow a divine foot in the door. This is what he's admitting, right?
Yeah, previous commitment. Yep.
I did an article on the website called Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Because I found out there was a secular group offering $1 million to anyone who, this group, they're dedicated to finding the answer to what one of their members calls the most pressing question in science, the origin of the genetic instructions on the DNA. And he points out that, genetic instructions don't write themselves any more than a software program writes itself. They're offering $1 million for a naturalistic way. Nobody's ever going to get the million.
No.
Because the only where information comes from is an intelligent mind. Stay tuned, we'll have some more.
In recent years, NASA probes have sent back images of our nearest planet, Mars. These images have prompted some scientists to suggest that a global flood once carved the Martial landscape, even though no liquid water has yet been found. The Bible records an event that certainly sounds like a global flood on Earth. Genesis records that all the high mountains under the entire heavens were covered. Jesus himself, referring to those not on Noah's Ark, said, "The flood came and took them all away." Unlike the elusive water on Mars, water covers 70% of the Earth's surface, and water-deposited sedimentary rock covers much of the land surface. So isn't it strange that many people who are open to the possibility of a global flood on Mars, despite the absence of water, immediately dismiss any suggestion that a global flood occurred on Earth?
To find out more from Creation Ministries International, visit our website, creation.com.
Welcome back to Creation Magazine Live. We're asking the question, why does the evidence always seem to point to evolution?
Why, oh why?
Why, oh why? Since the beginning of the modern evolutionary movement, there's been an effort really to deny the supernatural.
Right.
Really, that's the point, right? And revelation from God's Word, the Bible, anything like that's just denied. And foremost in promoting ideas like that were started with an anti-Christian lawyer named Charles Lyell. And even evolutionists have admitted, he started the ball rolling with a bias, because he started the concept of millions of years, which is required for atheism.
Right, yes. Here's what Stephen Jay Gould records, himself an evolutionist, says about Lyell. Charles Lyell was a lawyer by profession, and his book is one of the most brilliant briefs published. Lyell relied on 2 bits of cunning to establish his uniformitarian views as the only true geology. First, he set up a straw man to demolish. In fact, the catastrophists were much more empirically minded than Lyell. The geologic record does seem to require catastrophes. Rocks are fractured and contorted, whole faunas are wiped out. To circumvent this, to circumvent this literal appearance, Lyell imposed his imagination upon the evidence. The geologic record, he argued, is extremely imperfect, and we must interpolate into it what we can reasonably infer but cannot see. The catastrophists were the hard-nosed empiricists of the day, not the blinded theological apologists.
Right. So, okay, at the time when Lyell was coming up with his uniformitarianist theories, there was a group of Christian Bible believers called
scriptural geologists.
Scriptural geologists,
Yes. Yeah.
And they looked at the rocks and they said, "Well, look at all these things. This is evidence of a catastrophe." Gould admits, "Yeah, of course, if you just look at it, it looks like a catastrophe." But Lyell knew how to argue as a lawyer, and he imposed his vision of millions of years on it. And basically, Lyell's theory has been totally overthrown. Modern geology it's neo-catastrophism.
Right.
So, you know what? The evidence does point to what the Bible says. But we can see that Lyell reinterpreted what it should have been evident as catastrophes. But Lyell actually revealed his motivation in some of the letters that he wrote.
He did,
You can actually look at this. Here's Lyell himself from his own words trying to get portions of his book into a science journal, the Quarterly Review. And look what he says to his friend. Now, it's in Old English, so you got to kind of read through some of the stuff, but watch what he says. "I trust I shall make my sketch of the progress of geology popular. Old Fleming, Reverend Fleming, is frightened and thinks the age will not stand my anti-mosaical conclusions, and at least that the subject will for a time become unpopular and awkward for the clergy. But I'm not afraid. I shall out with the whole thing, but in as conciliatory a manner as possible." What he's saying is, he wanted to reinterpret Genesis. He wanted to add millions of years to the historical sketch.
Yeah.
And this reverend, he's scared. Maybe people aren't going to, trust that because it's against the Bible, against Moses. But he's going to do it. He's just going to try to do it in a nice way so people don't get upset. He said, "I'm sure you may get into the Quarterly Review what will free the science from Moses. And if we don't irritate, which I fear that we may, though mere history, we shall carry all with us. If you don't trump over them, but compliment the liberality and candor of the present age, the bishops and the enlightened saints will join us in despising both the ancient and modern physico-theologians." See, there was even amongst some of the clergy, there was this idea towards naturalism. And he said, we can get them on our side and convince people the Bible's not true. He said, it's just this time to strike. So rejoice that, sinner as you are, the Quarterly Review is open to you. And then he said in his P.S., "I conceived the idea 5 or 6 years ago that if ever the Mosaic geology could be set down without giving offense, it would be an historical sketch, and you must abstract mine in order to have as little to say as possible yourself. Let them feel it and point to the moral." He said he came up with an idea. If you got rid of Moses, you'd take everything down,
yes,
right?
Yeah, and what moral is he pointing to? Well, here in John 5, "If you believe Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me. But since you do not believe what he wrote, how are you going to believe what I say?" That's Jesus speaking.
That's Jesus speaking. So Lyell understood it. He had an agenda. You get rid of Moses, people don't believe what Moses wrote. They don't believe what Jesus says.
Yeah.
And this is exactly what we see now in our culture. Stay tuned.
Creation Ministries International staff, many from a wide variety of scientific disciplines, have produced thousands of articles now available in a massive online database. Some of the topics covered include the feasibility of Noah's Ark and evidence for a global flood, scientific arguments that explain observations in astronomy within a young Earth timeframe, recent discoveries that support dinosaurs fitting with biblical history, evidence from biology that shows that the type of change that is observed in living things has absolutely nothing to do with evolution. Got questions? Get answers at creation.com.
Welcome back to Creation Magazine Live. We've been talking about why does the evidence always seem to point to evolution, and what we've seen is there's a bit of a bias there. Well, I'm going to show you a quote from Aldous Huxley, and this man, a very committed atheist, but he was honest in his admission as to why he wanted to accept, naturalism, etc. Look what he said. "I had motive for not wanting the world to have a meaning, consequently assumed that it had none, and was able without any difficulty to find satisfying reasons for this assumption. The philosopher who finds no meaning in the world is not concerned exclusively with a problem in pure metaphysics. He is also concerned to prove that there is no valid reason why he personally should not do as he wants to do, or why his friends should not seize political power, and govern in any way that they find most advantageous to themselves. For myself, the philosophy of meaninglessness was essentially an instrument of liberation, sexual and political. No meaning, no God to impose any meaning on anything.
Wow.
As soon as
Make
you
up your own
do
rules.
that, you can do anything you want. That's what he admitted.
Yeah. Interesting. Indeed, atheists have a motive for their not wanting to be a God. Far from being a neutral worldview, it is a worldview. It's not a neutral position. Many have been taught that creationism is religious, it's not scientific, and there's been trials over the years. The famous Dover trials years ago, that was basically where the judge deemed, based on expert testimony from people like Michael Roos, who testified evolution was based on science.
And intelligent design.
And the ID movement, that's just a version of creationism. It's religious, it has no basis in science and so on. However, Roos went on later to say that it's okay to say different things in different contexts.
Different audiences.
Different audiences and so on. He said this, I realize that when one is dealing with people, say at a school level or these sorts of things, certain sorts of arguments are appropriate. But those of us who are academics should recognize that the science side has certain metaphysical assumptions built into doing science, which it may not be a good thing to admit in a court of law. But I think that in honesty, that we should recognize and that we should be thinking about some of these sorts of things.
Now, he testified at the Dover trials. Evolution science, creationism that's just religious.
Religion, yeah.
But I'm going to give you a quote he said years later that actually shocked the evolutionary community. And,
Yes.
he actually became very honest in this statement. Look what he says. Evolution is promoted by its practitioners as more than mere science. Evolution is promulgated as an ideology, a secular religion, a full-fledged alternative to Christianity with meaning and morality. I am an ardent evolutionist and an ex-Christian, but I must admit that in this one complaint, and Mr. Gish is but one of the many to make it, he was a creationist, Dr. Gish, the literalists are absolutely right. Evolution is a religion. This was true of evolution in the beginning, and it's true of evolution still today. Evolution, therefore, came into being as a kind of secular ideology, an explicit substitute for Christianity. Now, if you took that quote and he had said that at the Dover trial, things might have gone very differently.
Would have been a completely different trial, because now they're on the same level, right?
Right.
They're both beliefs.
But we need to understand something. If you're an atheist, you have no absolute moral code.
Right.
I mean, this man lied blatantly, right? He professed one thing sitting there in front of the court, but then he later on admitted, no, evolution, that's a religion. It's a religious way of looking at it, and it's anti-Christian. It was created to circumvent Christianity.
Yes.
So we can see, does the evidence point to evolution? Because there's such a huge bias. See you next time.